Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I call this meeting of the NCUA Board to order. In addition to those joining us in the boardroom today, I want to note for the record that today's meeting is open to the public through a live webcast. Last week, we observed Veterans Day at the NCUA and across the country. So as we begin our meeting, I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the NCUA veterans among us for their selfless service and for showing us the true meaning of patriotism. Your sacrifices and those of your families have not gone unnoticed. Our country is forever indebted to you. Thank you. I'll pause here for any comments by Vice Chairman Hauptman and Board Member Hood. Mr. Vice Chairman?
You bet. I want to extend my appreciation for the vets in the room. I know, G, you were Marines, right? And for that matter, people who are currently enlisted. The word veteran means you've completed your military service. So shout out to those who are enlisted as well. And I tell you this, you can't not notice the veterans as employees. They're quality employees, often given responsibility at a younger age that you don't get in normal careers. And I'll say one last thing. I never served a day, but there's no way I'm in this chair right now if 60 years ago my dad had not taken the GI Bill. Served 2 years in the Army, stationed in Japan. He was the first one to finish high school in his family. His dad put up the advertising in New York City subway. That was his job. And my dad was the first one to finish high school and then finish college, and I cannot imagine, had he not taken that step, get himself out of a rough part of Brooklyn, join the Army, if he had not done that, I cannot see any way that I am in this chair right now today. I'll stop there.
It's a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing.
It is a wonderful story.
Board Member Hood?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too want to honor our veterans, both our employees who are with us at the agency, and also I too want to commemorate and thank our wonderful men and women in uniform. I'll never forget, just a short while ago, I was a guest on one of the bases there in Florida, and I was able to visit with some of the men and women in uniform. And I will say to them what I want to share with you. I thank them for giving me the wonderful personal freedom that I get to enjoy, which is why I fight so tirelessly on their behalf to give them economic freedom. So I am the son of a veteran. My father served in the Army in Vietnam, so I honor him and what he did for this country. But more importantly, I just want to thank all of our veterans and for what we as an agency get to do every day on behalf of the veterans, and with one of the rules that we'll be voting on today as well. So thank you all.
And thank you both, and thank you again to the NCUA's veterans. Our first item of business today on the agenda is the quarterly board briefing about the Share Insurance Fund's performance. Eugene Sheed, Chief Financial Officer, is the only staff presenting. Good morning, Eugene. It's always good to see you here at the board table. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, and good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Hauptman, and Board Member Hood. I am here this morning to present the 2023 third quarter financial statistics for the Share Insurance Fund. Before I discuss the quarter's financial statements, I want to let the audience know that the NCUA's Office of the Inspector General, through its contract with KPMG, prepared an audit report for the purposes of providing financial information to the U.S. Department of Treasury and the U.S. Government Accountability Office to use in preparing the audited financial statements for the U.S. government. KPMG's recent report found that the schedules provided by NCUA fairly present, in all material respects, the investments and other taxes and receipts of the NCUA as of September 30th, 2023, and in accordance with U.S. generally accepted accounting principles. Slide 2. This table shows the Share Insurance Fund's revenues and expenses for the third quarter of 2023. For the quarter ended September 30th, the fund recorded a net income of $59 million. A few of the highlights for the quarter are total income was $113.4 million, mainly the result of investment income in Treasury securities. Investment income increased 12% as compared to the prior quarter and 54% as compared to the third quarter of 2022. Operating expenses were $59.2 million, mainly attributable to the overhead transfer for agency operating expenses. The provision for insurance losses and reserve expense was $9.7 million. And finally, the asset management estate loss reduction for consumer credit unions and corporate credit unions were $0.2 million and $14.3 million for the quarter, respectively, due to cash collections and favorable changes in estimated future cash flows of assets. Slide 3. This table shows the fund's balance sheet as of September 30th compared to the previous quarter. Total assets were valued at $21 billion, of which 97% were funds held with the U.S. Treasury in cash, overnight investments, and long-term Treasury notes. A few highlights to know are that the fund recognized the capital deposit receivable of $475.5 million, which has now been 100% collected as of this week. Accounts payable and other liabilities includes cap deposit refunds to those credit unions who have lower insured shares in the amount of $123.3 million. And finally, cumulative results of operation decreased by $26.1 million due to an unrealized loss of investment income of $85.1 million, offset by the $59 million in net income from the previous slide. Slide 4. The Share Insurance Fund records an insurance program liability comprised of both general and specific reserves. This is a contingency to cover anticipated future losses resulting from insured credit union failures. Each quarter, we assess the reserve needs for potential and actual credit union failures to make a reasonable estimate of potential losses. During the third quarter, the reserve balance increased by a total of $10.2 million, primarily due to an increase in the general reserve. The reserve balance totaled $214.3 million, and that was comprised of $7.3 million for specific reserves and $207 million for general reserves at the end of the quarter. Slide 5. Through the third quarter of 2023, 3 credit union failures incurred a loss to the fund. There was one involuntary liquidation without a purchase and assumption agreement, and there were 2 assisted mergers. The total cost of these failures at the time of failure was $1.41 million, and fraud was not identified as a contributing factor to either of these 3 failures. Slide 6. As of September 30th, 2023, the Share Insurance Fund had over $21.6 billion at par value invested in Treasury securities with maturities out to February of 2030. The average weighted life of securities held by the fund is 2.6 years. The weighted average yield of securities held by the fund is increased 18 basis points from the previous quarter to 2.13%. A notable change from the prior quarter is that overnight investments increased from $3.2 billion to $4 billion as of September 30th. This reflects the position I described in my last quarterly briefing that the investment committee had set a target of $4 billion for overnights to meet potential liquidity needs without the risk of selling any of the portfolio at a loss. With the $4 billion target having now been met, the investment committee continues to consider the timing for returning to its laddering portfolio approach. For this quarter, the maturities have been rolled into the overnights. Those maturities occurred earlier this week. As of last night, the balance of the portfolio invested in overnights now stands at $5.2 billion, which as of last night earned 539 basis points, or about $773,000.
Eugene, your slide is not matching the text that you're talking about.
I
We may need,
apologize for that.
no, that's fine.
Can we
I
go
think it
back
would be
to slide 6?
We are on slide 6. For some reason,
The
there's
numbering seems off.
maybe tried slide 7.
Thank you. Can we go back forward one more slide?
2.
Or 2? Can we advance one more slide?
I think they're working, I can see that they're working intently in the back corner.
There we
There
go.
we go.
Perfect.
All right, thank you. So as I was saying regarding the investment portfolio, we had the $4 billion target. It's now been met. As of last night, there was $5.2 billion in the overnights, earning 539 basis points, or about $773,000. And the committee will continue to discuss the further approach in anticipation of the next quarterly maturities, which I believe are scheduled for February of 2024. Next slide, 7. There we go. The equity ratio. Looking at the equity ratio chart, the equity ratio is updated on a semi-annual basis. As of June 30th, 2023, the equity ratio was 1.27%, which was a decrease of 3 basis points from December 2022, and calculated using the insured share base of $1.7 trillion. The blue line across the chart represents the normal operating level, which has been set by the board at 1.33% currently. Slide 8 turns us to the CAMEL information. So third quarter CAMEL's data is presented on the following 2 slides, current as of September 30th, 2023. This slide shows the percentage of insured shares by CAMEL's codes from 2018 through the third quarter of 2023. In the graph, the dark blue represents CAMEL's coded 4 or 5, the gray represents CAMEL's coded 3, and the light blue at the bottom represents CAMEL's coded 1 or 2, with respect to the percentage of total insured shares. The table underneath the graph shows the total number of credit unions by these CAMEL codes. And I will note that the graphic is not presented to scale. During the quarter, the percentage of insured shares at credit unions CAMEL's coded 3 increased, while the percentage of insured shares at credit unions with CAMEL's code 1 or 2 and in the category of 4 or 5 decreased. As depicted in the bottom table, the number of credit unions as of September 30th, 2023 stood at 4,659, a decrease of 30 credit unions from the prior quarter. Slide 9. This slide compares the credit union's CAMEL's codes by asset size. CAMEL's coded 4 and 5 credit unions are shown on the left-hand side, whereas CAMEL coded 3 credit unions are shown on the right-hand side of the graph. Looking at the 131 total credit unions that are CAMEL's coded 4 or 5 by asset size, most of these credit unions continue to have assets of $100 million or less. For those with assets greater than $100 million, there were 5 less credit unions in the $100 million to $500 million range. And for those with assets greater than $500 million, there was 1 less credit union comparing June 30th to September 30th, 2023. During the quarter, the assets of insured shares in credit unions CAMEL's coded 4 and 5 decreased. Considering now the 777 credit unions CAMEL's coded 3, 93% of these credit unions have total assets that are less than $500 million. During the quarter, there was a decrease in the credit unions with assets less than $100 million and an increase in credit unions with assets in the $100 to $500 million range and the greater than $500 million ranges for the CAMEL's coded 3. During the quarter, both assets and insured shares for credit unions CAMEL's code 3 increased. Insured shares increased from $77.7 billion to $110.3 billion, and assets increased from $91 billion to $131.7 billion. Slide 10. In closing, I will note that the supplemental information provided with this presentation includes additional information to help interested parties understand the operations of the Share Insurance Fund. This concludes my presentation, and I will be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Eugene, for your report on the performance of the National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund in the third quarter of 2023. And I know that much effort occurs behind the scenes as we prepare for today's briefing, so thank you to your entire team for their hard work. The Share Insurance Fund's performance in the third quarter of 2023 mirrors the industry's financial performance over the last year. Like the credit union system, the Share Insurance Fund is performing well overall, but there are some flashing cautionary lights that we should all heed and act upon. For several months, the NCUA has reported signs of growing liquidity, interest rate, and credit risks within the credit union system. In today's report, we see that stress firsthand, especially in large, complex credit unions with more than $500 million in assets. In fact, as shown on slide 9, the number of large, complex credit unions with composite Camel's Code 3 rating increased by 9 credit unions to a total of 51 credit unions in the third quarter. Assets in the Camel's Code 3 group for credit unions of all sizes also increased to $131.7 billion, as shown in the bottom right-hand corner of slide 9. That is nearly 45% higher than the previous quarter's results. This sudden rise may be startling for some, but it should have been expected. After all, the continued high levels of interest rate risk have increased credit union liquidity risks, contributed to asset quality deterioration and capital erosion, and placed pressure on earnings. What is more concerning for me, however, is the rapid rise in total assets for composite Camel's Code $3 billion plus credit unions. If not addressed quickly by the credit union management, these problems could escalate into Camel's Code 4 and 5 ratings and even failures. And it's the billion-dollar plus credit unions that pose the greatest risks to the Share Insurance Fund. The rising risks within the credit union system also demonstrate why the NCUA board must ensure the agency's 2024 budget has sufficient resources to examine, supervise, and mitigate these growing risks. Some may not like the size of the increase proposed in the staff draft budget, but it is our job to protect credit union members and the system. Other issues, including the reinstatement of federal student loan repayments, rising costs for property and casualty insurance, and consumers drawing down the last of their pandemic-era savings, will also affect already strained household finances going forward. And those household-level issues could eventually roll on to the credit union's books as delinquencies and charge-offs. So the NCUA, credit unions, and the public should be prepared for further impact on the asset distribution of the system's Camel's ratings. It will get worse before it gets better. That brings me to my first question, Eugene. On slide 8, we see a 275 basis point increase in the percentage of insured shares held in composite Camel 3 code credit unions since the end of 2022. This brisk pace of increase concerns me. How rapid is the growth of insured shares in Camel's Code 3 credit unions compared to what we have experienced in prior business cycles?
So as compared to prior business cycles, we first went back and took a look at the last 10 years, which would include the taxi cab period, and we found no evidence of any cycle that saw this kind of increase. So then we went back a bit further, and you have to go back to the Great Recession in the 2007 to 2010 period, where we did see instances of quarter-over-quarter increases that were larger than what we've seen this quarter. But again, you have to go back to the Great Recession.
Thank you, Eugene. That's a bit sobering to hear. The NCUA will continue to monitor credit union performance and mitigate risks through the examination process, off-site monitoring, and tailored supervision. The NCUA board will also closely watch credit union and Share Insurance Fund performance in the quarters ahead and act to protect the system as needed. Additionally, and I cannot emphasize this enough, credit union executives, supervisors, and boards of directors must remain diligent in managing the potential risks on their balance sheet and when monitoring economic conditions and the interest rate environment. Today's economic environment requires active, not passive management by all. Additionally, the NCUA must ensure the Share Insurance Fund remains healthy and fortify the system's defenses for potential risks ahead. With the rising Camel Code 3 credit unions, the Share Insurance Fund's general reserve balance increased by $10.2 million in the third quarter, as shown on slide 4. At the end of the quarter, the reserve balance totaled $214.3 million, with $7.3 million set aside for specific reserves and $207 million set aside for general reserves. Eugene, when you look at the number of credit union failures and the cost to the Share Insurance Fund, as we saw on slide 5, the actual cash losses have been small, about $1.4 million year to date.
Would you elaborate on why general reserves are high when actual cash losses have been so small? And please discuss the NCUA's methodology for reserving for potential losses for the Share Insurance Fund. For example, I've long had concerns that the Share Insurance Fund's current reserving methodology does not consider black swan events.
Okay, so thank you for that question, and I would guess there's several parts to that, and I'd start with the part about the black swan events, where the methodology, as I've mentioned in my statement, includes two parts. There's a specific reserve and a general reserve. The general reserve really is there to ensure that we've got sufficient funds to cover probable losses at any given time.
Sure.
And the modeling that we do for the general reserve does attempt to take into consideration the totality of the current situation that we see within the industry. So it does not, I would say, unlike some modeling that we sometimes talk about, it does not exclude, per se, black swan events. The modeling kind of takes into account the current state of the credit unions, similar factors to the CAMEL ratings, which is why they often move in tandem with each other, as well as macroeconomic data that we're seeing. And again, the purpose of that is to kind of get a systemic look at essentially a financial risk to the SIF based on current economic performance and credit unions in the industry. And then we have the specific reserves, where when we know something more particular is probable, estimable, we can value it, then we create that specific reserve. Looking at slide, I think you mentioned slide 5.
I did.
So let's take one thing I want to point out on slide 5, if we can bring that one up. Is sort of this discrepancy that you see in actual cash losses in any particular year. So on slide 5, you see that this is a 5-year, actually we got 6 years of data up there. In 2018, there were $784 million, $785 million of losses. Whereas in the 2 years later, we're down to $1.6 million in losses. So huge variability in terms of what happens in terms of actual losses in any particular year. So the general reserve model is trying to kind of guess where you're going to be between some events that are extreme at one end and kind of extreme at the other end.
Right.
So it's generally not going to nail the upper and the lower ends perfectly. What you want is to kind of have a model that, as conditions start to deteriorate, the reserve starts to go up in anticipation of those potential cash payouts. And then as economic conditions improve, the reserving comes down, because the general reserve model goes both ways. It goes up some quarters, it comes down in others.
We're trying to get to that proverbial just right.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. On slide 6, which shows the Share Insurance Fund's portfolio, Eugene, you reported that the NCUA reached its goal of allocating $4 billion of the Share Insurance Fund's investments into overnights at the Treasury. Thank you for that. We made this change to ensure adequate liquidity. I understand that the investment committee will soon be evaluating next steps. Where do you think the Share Insurance Fund's allocations will be at the end of this year and going into 2024?
Sure. So for at this point, when the investment committees met, we decided for the maturities that would happen during this current quarter, which again happened earlier this week, that we would take those funds and put them into the overnights, bearing in mind kind of what we can continue to see in terms of some of the data that we've already talked about, and that at this point we think having that additional liquidity makes sense, so that if there issues do arise, we wouldn't have to sell any other remaining portfolio, because everything outside of the overnights is still in a loss position, and so we don't want to sell at a loss. So for the end of this year, we should be at about $5.2 billion in overnights. The next maturities would happen in February, and prior to that, we'll take another assessment of liquidity needs, what's happening economically in the credit union system at that time, and deciding whether we continue to kind of build up the liquidity in the form of the overnights, or whether we start to move some or all of the maturities back into the latter strategy as we were doing a couple of years ago.
And Eugene, if I remember correctly, we've got about 7% of our investments in the share insurance fund portfolio are underwater. That is, the interest rate environment has changed them. And that compares better to the overall credit union industry at this point in time, which is, I believe, slightly above 10%, if I remember correctly.
In total, that would be about right, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying those points. It's important that the share insurance funds portfolio be structured to meet both our immediate and our long-term needs. The NCUA is committed to protecting credit union members and the safety and soundness of the system. No one, let me repeat this, no one has ever lost a single penny of insured deposits. Should the stress in the credit union system increase, we must take necessary actions to maintain the system's stability, safeguard consumer share deposits, and ensure the share insurance fund's strength. Fortunately, I know that the NCUA team is prepared to meet any challenges that we might face. And Eugene, that's thanks to you, everybody on the investment committee, all those in your team, and so many others within the NCUA. So I do believe we're ready and fortified. We just have to be watchful. Thank you again, Eugene, for your briefing today. That concludes my remarks. I now recognize the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Eugene, and the staff for your excellent work on this. I'm going to repeat some of the broad things that Mr. Harper said. Here at NCUA, we've observed the strain on the credit union system due to inflation and higher rates, heightened risks related to liquidity and interest rate risks, which are essentially two sides of the same coin. That's put increased pressure on credit union balance sheets and on household budgets. Delinquency rates for loans rose slightly to 63 basis points. This pressure, financial pressure, is evident in the rising number of CAMELS Code 3, 4, and 5 credit unions, especially the credit unions with more than $500 million in assets. But I do want to stress credit unions have demonstrated stability and resilience in the face of various economic challenges. As of the end of the second quarter this year, system's net worth ratio was 10.6%, continuing year-over-year growth in assets and in lending. And while total interest expense has gone up substantially over the year, the industry's return on average assets remains solid at 79 basis points. It's a decent number. As of second quarter, as Eugene said, the insurance fund insured 1.7 trillion in deposits, and that's 92%. That number is 92% of the total share deposits in the system, meaning 92% of the deposits at credit unions are insured by NCUA. So only 8% uninsured. And we look back at the failure of Silicon Valley Bank in the spring. It's worth noting that not one credit union has a situation remotely comparable to Silicon Valley Bank, where 97% of their deposits were uninsured. That was a result of a business model with a relatively small number of very large business accounts, which obviously does not resemble any credit union. The SIF had no significant realized losses, a small increase in unrealized losses due to one credit union failure, and a small reserve expense due to the increase in CAMELS 3, 4, 5. The fund has reached its goal, I believe, 4 million in overnight funds, earning just over 5% now. And as we reach the end of the year, the rate environment will continue to evolve. The Fed funds futures as of this morning, 1 year from now, Christmas 2024, the modal outcome for the market is for the Fed to lower 100 basis points. That's the modal outcome, okay? That's not a prediction. That is just what this marketplace says. A few questions. We mentioned the reserves and the methodology. I'm not going to ask about the methodology again. What is the dollar amount in reserves?
$210 million.
Okay. And the credit union failures, you had a graph going back to 2018. What's an average amount that we have to write a check for a failure? We have credit unions under $1 million assets up to 170 billion. It varies massively, but when we have to write a check.
Oh, so I mean, I think on that slide, the number of credit unions for which we had to write a check in any particular year is relatively small.
Right.
I mean, number less than 10, and the value ranging from $750 million down to $1.4 million. So, I mean, there's huge variation there in terms of if you did literally a mathematical average, it probably wouldn't be that reflective, because what you've got in that population are a couple of really large checks and then a larger number of very small checks from the smaller credit unions.
In the last 5 years, the largest check we wrote was how much?
So 750
million
related to the taxi cabs.
That was 2018.
18.
Okay. 18. Gotcha. All right. And the small one, some of the credit union failures don't we have to take them over. It doesn't involve a check or a very small one,
Or
right?
it involves an assisted merger or something where we are making a payout.
Yeah.
The one for this quarter was, I believe, roughly $160,000.
160,000, all right. We're going to talk about the budget this afternoon, but the increase, just the increase that we're taking essentially from the SIF is 34 million. If you cut that in half, let's just say you'd be at 17 million. That would pay for $100,000 failures. So Camel's 3, 4, 5, I recognize there are our ratings, so that shows a darker picture. 3, 4, 5 are worse grades. But I know they're our ratings. If you remember the financial crisis, remember AAA paper? Some of it wasn't worth anything. They're humans doing ratings, so they're only worth something if they're worth something. Why do we see the increase? What's the main factor?
So I think the main factors are some of which has already been alluded to in the discussion this morning. So interest rate and liquidity risk would be a couple of the major factors. And also I think they're identified as other risk factors include risk management, audits, accounting, information security, credit risk record keeping. I think have all been contributing factors to one degree or another, depending on the particular credit union.
Gotcha. And last thing, commercial real estate, a lot of news on that. I personally think there's another shoe to drop on that. If you've been to any downtown in DC and other major cities, banks have issues there. They have loans. A lot of that is from investors. What is the exposure to the credit union system to commercial real estate?
Sure. So in discussing with the Office of Examination and Insurance, I understand the credit union exposure is relatively low, and some specifics on that. Preliminary call report data as of the end of September, federally insured credit unions hold about $140 billion in commercial real estate loans, which is about 8.9% of total loans in the system, so relatively small. And then slightly beyond that, most of the credit unions that do hold commercial real estate loans are not highly concentrated in the product. And to put that concentration into some perspective, only 7% of the federally insured credit unions have commercial real estate concentrations over 100% of their net worth.
Gotcha. And we should mention commercial real estate is a very specific thing. It is big city, downtown office buildings. I spoke with people at ICBA yesterday, the community bank lobby, and they said their commercial real estate is actually doing okay because it's normally a strip mall and, you know, a nail salon and a restaurant. That is doing fine. The commercial real estate issues are very specific. Downtown, commercial use, office buildings in major cities. That's the shoe to drop, and it's good to see that that's a bullet we can dodge. Back to the chairman.
At least we hope. Thank you so much, Board Member Hood.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Eugene, as always, for your continued and thorough oversight of our National Credit Union Share Insurance Fund. I also want to thank you and your team in ACFA for the great work that you do each and every day to support these quarterly updates. I recently had the pleasure to meet with the entire ACFO team at their all-staff meeting, so thank you so much for giving me that opportunity, Eugene, to meet your team and to thank them all in person for all the great work that you all are doing each and every day. And I was really pleased to see how motivated they were. You really have quite a motivated and exciting team. Anyway, just seeing them all en masse really meant the world to me. But now, back to the business at hand. You've all heard me say this before, but I view these quarterly updates as essential in giving the credit unions and their member owners a clear perspective on how we are being responsible fiduciaries and stewards of their fund. With that in mind, Eugene, I do have a few questions, and I will admit the chairman and vice chairman have already asked some of my questions, so I won't belabor any of those points. But are we still on track for the same projected earnings and equity ratio for year-end 2023 as you previously shared in the last quarterly share insurance fund update?
Sure. And first, I'll thank you for taking the time to meet with the team. They very thoroughly appreciated that you'd take the time to meet with them, so they enjoyed it. And I will say, yes, I believe that we remain on track for the same projected earnings and equity ratio for the year-end 2023. The equity ratio projection, just to remind everybody, is 1.27%. Going a little bit deeper, because we're about halfway through now the fourth quarter, I would say earnings are tending maybe slightly higher than was projected, and insured share growth may be slightly lower, but I don't think those are going to have a significant impact on the outcome that we'll see at the end of the year.
Very well, thank you. And I know we previously discussed the possibility for the NCUA investing some of its available funds outside of the treasuries, such as with the Federal Reserve System. Are we still exploring those opportunities?
Yes, sir. We are still in the process of assessing sort of the current investment policy and exploring the opportunity to possibly have some funds in other locations.
Very well, thank you for that. And I know we've already talked about how you all have exceeded the targeted amount of overnight. So I'm really pleased with that. And I'm also pleased when you mentioned how much we made overnight. Can you mention that again? That really made me jump out of my seat.
Yeah, so $770,000 is what we've been making at
Every 24 hours.
every 24 hours, as long as the
Yeah, of course.
we get the 539 basis points, which we've been seeing pretty consistently since the last Fed rate change.
Well, which has been music to all of our ears, I must say. When is the investment committee meeting again? I know you're going to be making another sort of decision in February. When is the next investment committee meeting?
So as such, the next meeting, I don't believe is formally scheduled, but we've already met a couple of times since the last board meeting to go over the current data, again, the estimating liquidity. And I imagine we'll meet again, if not before the holiday, shortly after, certainly prior to the February maturities.
Very well, thank you. And I know in your Q&A with the vice chairman, we talked a little bit about the credit union failures so far this year. And you all, typically when we've had failures and maybe a small hit to the fund, it's been resulting because of fraud. It is really interesting to note now that a lot of the failures that you've already discussed are interest rate risk, liquidity risk, some of the basic things that we really want our credit unions to really be mindful of. So what I would just say is all of our credit unions, please remain vigilant about fundamental enterprise risk management processes. I continue when I'm out speaking to the credit unions and the boards and some of the various trade groups. I'm emphasizing the need for credit unions to always stay up to date on all the supervisory guidance and letters that are being issued by NCUA on topics, again, record keeping, interest rate risk, liquidity, credit, all of the things that come out in our supervisory letters. And again, I hope they're going to be mindful for when the 2024 supervisory priorities will be announced. But again, it used to be fraud, but now we're seeing all these other variables at play. So please remain vigilant. I know we've also talked a bit this morning about the reserve balances and our methodology, so I don't really want to go into that, especially since we've already talked about black swan events and the impact that it may have. But do we base our reserve assessments on historical losses? I want to make sure I'm understanding that. How do we look at the reserve assessments on historical losses, or is it an assessment on the future risk of a loss within the existing portfolio?
So I'd say it's more, so there is some historic perspective to it. I would say it's more focused on kind of how the economy and the credit union performance look at the current time. And so obviously some of the information can be a bit dated or backwards looking. But I would say it's more a reflection of kind of the current trends that we're seeing versus, and which, sort of by their nature, learn from history and take some of that into account. But it's more, where are we at today, and what does that possibly mean for the future?
Very well, thank you. I have no further questions, but again, thank you and ACFO for the great work you do every day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Board Member Hood, and I completely agree with you. $770,000 a night in overnight earnings is a much better day than $1,200 that we used to see when
Exactly.
Randell Jones and Marianne Woodson would present here.
Exactly.
And to the Vice Chairman, 100 basis point drop in where the interest rate environment is actually would relieve pressure on credit union balance sheet, taking some of those underwater investments, making them back, and that could improve some of the things that we're seeing. All of that is something that we're all going to have to watch and stand ready to act. That concludes our discussion of today's quarterly share insurance fund report. The second and final item on our agenda today is the final rule, Part 721, charitable donation accounts. Justin Anderson, Senior Staff Attorney, Office of General Counsel, will present the matter, and Rick Mayfield, Senior Capital Market Specialist, Office of Examination Insurance, will be available for any questions. Good morning, Justin. Good morning, Rick. It's always good to have both of you at the NCUA board table. Please begin when you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Harper, Vice Chairman Haltman, Board Member Hood. Rick and I are here to present a final rule that would amend the charitable donation account section of NCUA's Incidental Powers Regulation, Part 721. Specifically, this final rule will amend the definition of qualified charity to include any veterans group or organization recognized as exempt from taxation under Section 501c19 of the Internal Revenue Code. This change will allow federal credit unions to donate to veterans organizations through the use of charitable donation accounts. Rick and I presented the proposed rule at the May 2023 board meeting. The proposal included the change I just discussed and also asked commenters if there were additional entities the board should consider adding to the definition of qualified charities in potential future rulemakings. In response to the proposal, we received 7 total comments. 1 comment was outside the scope of the rulemaking. The remaining 6 all generally supported the proposed changes. 1 commenter of the 6 did request clarification of the applicability of the rule, which we did clarify in the preamble to this final. 4 of the 6 commenters did offer suggestions of various groups the board should consider adding to the definition of qualified charities in future rulemakings. Among those suggestions were civic leagues, social welfare organizations, local associations of employees, labor, agricultural organizations, business leagues, chamber of commerce, social and rec clubs, and qualified nonprofit health insurance. Based on the comments received, we are recommending the board finalize the addition of veterans organizations to the definition of qualified charity as proposed in the May 2023 rulemaking. This concludes our presentation, and we are happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Justin, for your presentation on this final rule, amending the charitable donation account section of the NCUA's Incidental Powers Regulation. With this final rule, the NCUA is taking an important step in honoring our nation's many veterans. Specifically, the final rule adds veterans organizations, as defined by the Internal Revenue Code, to the definition of qualified charity that a federal credit union may contribute to using a charitable donation account. As noted earlier, this final rule is being presented before the NCUA board largely as proposed. What's more, this rule makes sense and fits nicely within the credit union ethos of people helping people, which Board Member Hood likes to remind us often. Last week, our nation observed Veterans Day, a time when we recognize and thank our veterans for their service and sacrifice. Since 1776, the United States has fought nearly 8 dozen major wars and intervened militarily in many others, with every generation of Americans witnessing combat in one form or another. Over the years, tens of millions of Americans have worn the uniform of our nation's armed forces. The freedoms we cherish are not simply inherited. Rather, they are earned through the dedication and bravery of our servicemen and servicewomen of every generation. Their sacrifice and courage can never be forgotten, nor should their service be taken for granted. And this is why we should approve this final rule today. In doing so, we will make it easier for those credit unions opting to use charitable donation accounts to use those funds to support our nation's veterans and their families. In closing, this final rule is good for veterans, good for military families, good for credit union members, good for credit unions, and good for our country. Justin, thank you again for your work on this change in the NCUA's regulations, and Rick, your work as well on that. And thank you to the Vice Chairman and Senior Policy Advisor, Sarah Bang, for your efforts in moving this issue forward. That concludes my remarks. I now recognize the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, and thank you, Justin and Rick, for your work on this. It may seem like a small change, but it has the potential to create significant impact. As we know, credit unions grow mainly through earnings. The charitable donations program provides an innovative way to fund donations to charities without taking dollars away from regular income, including veterans organizations as permissible recipients of CDA donations. Strikes me as an appropriate change, and it's one more way to honor veterans. In 2013, when we first did this agency, first had a rule like this and only included 501c3. That is sort of the standard across a lot of these things. I have a Fidelity gift account, and it only allows me to do 501c3s. So I don't think the agency erred back then, but it was brought to our attention that 501c19s are something that were valued to a lot of credit unions, especially the defense credit unions. They're a very large part of the system. 30% of America's 137 million credit union members belong to military credit unions, and there's also non-military credit unions in areas with large military populations or military retiree populations. So it's fitting to give all credit unions the ability to take advantage of charitable donation accounts to support charities that benefit their military members. I want to thank all the defense credit unions who brought this to our attention. And I want to thank, again, Marion County Veterans Honor Guard in Kentucky, who educated us on this subject. Couple questions. All the comments we got supported the rule, but one felt it needed further clarification on which veterans organizations qualified as a charity. How do we have clarity on this?
Vice Chairman, I'll take that question. In the final rule preamble, we reiterated that any group or organization that qualifies as a 501c19 under the Internal Revenue Code will be considered a veterans organizations for purposes of this rule. That concludes my answer. Thank you.
Okay. And minimum distribution requirements, my Fidelity account has the same thing. You know, you get the tax deduction, it's supposed to wind up at charities. What are the minimum distribution requirements?
So Vice Chairman Huffman, I'll take this question. The minimum distribution requirements for the CDA account is a minimum of 51% of the total return. So the credit union can only keep 49% of the total return, but 51% has to go to a charitable organization, and they have to make that, they need to make that distribution within a 5-year period. So, for example, they could give 75% of the total return every 2 years, but they have to be within those confines for it to qualify as a minimum distribution.
What do you mean by return in this
So
case?
it's a total return concept. So they have to calculate, and that's why we have separate account. We require separate accounts within the CDA so they can calculate what their total return is for that account. And of the total return, the gain, they have to distribute at least 51% to a qualified charity at least every 5 years.
What if it loses money and there's no return?
They don't. They don't have to make any distributions if it loses money.
Yeah, again, the Fidelity one I have, you can put it in stocks. Like you can have less money.
So
There is no positive
if there's
return.
no earnings, they don't have to do distribution. But if they have a positive total return, they have to make a distribution of at least 51% to a qualified charity within a 5-year period.
Gotcha. Has to be a positive return for this to be relevant.
For it to be required.
For it to be required.
Yes.
For it to be required.
If they don't make money, they can still kick
That's
money
right.
out of it.
Yeah.
But if they do have earnings, they have a required minimum distribution amount and within a 5-year period.
Gotcha. That concludes my remarks.
Thank you so much. Board Member Hood, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Justin, for your presentation today. And of course, thank you as well, Rick, for joining us this morning. I am absolutely delighted that we are finalizing the charitable donations rule today. By incorporating certain veterans organizations as qualified charities, this final rule will enable federal credit unions to contribute to these entities through charitable donations accounts. This will allow federal credit unions, especially those with fields of membership that serve members of the military and defense organizations, the ability to better serve their members and give them more ways to support veterans groups and organizations. President Abraham Lincoln once aptly stated, and I quote, "Any nation that does not honor its heroes will not long endure," end quote. This final rule today is another example of the NCUA's ability to continuously demonstrate our support for our uniformed heroes. And ladies and gentlemen, what a better timing than this to approve this final rule than during the same month that our nation honors and celebrates these heroes on Veterans Day. Yet, as I've consistently emphasized, acknowledging the service of our military members and acknowledging the debt we owe them is not confined to a single day or week. It is an enduring commitment, and today's final rule is a testament of us upholding this pledge. For that reason, I am thrilled to support the final rule, and I have no questions other than to say thank you for bringing the rule to us today. Mr. Chairman, I yield back my time.
Thank you so much. Vice Chairman Hauptman, is there a motion?
Yes, sir. I move that the board approve final rule, part 721 of NCUA's rules and regulations as attached to the board action memorandum.
Is there a second to the motion?
Second.
There is a sufficient second. All those in favor say aye.
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 Aye. Oh,
All those opposed, say nay. The ayes have it, and let the record show that the motion passed 3-0. That is the end of our agenda today. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation and for your hard work on this rulemaking. Before I gavel this out, I know that I and the entire board wish everyone safe travels and a good Thanksgiving in the week ahead. We will meet later today in the NCUA Event Center for the annual NCUA budget, and then again in December for the NCUA board meeting. I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Vice Chairman Altman?
No, just best wishes, safe travels on Thanksgiving. If any of you are home alone on Thanksgiving, call me because I need to borrow some chairs. Okay? I'm kidding. Happy Thanksgiving.
Board Member Hood.
I want to say happy Thanksgiving to all of you here in our NCUA family. We certainly appreciate the team members here. I hope you have safe travels. And one of the things I know our family tradition is to go around the table and mentioning one or two things that we're particularly grateful for. So I'm grateful for all of you and what you all have done to help 138 million members have access to their accounts and credit unions. So thank you all and happy Thanksgiving.
I certainly second that motion and notion, and I'm sure the Vice Chairman does too. That being the end of our